and I told a story in a meeting about riding the train around Chicago, the public transportation. So we were trading public transportation stories. And he said, I remember riding the subway in D.C., and there were signs on the train that said these had 3 rules. And those 3 rules, and I said, yeah, I was in Chicago too, and the rules were the same. No loud music, no smoking, and don't go through the emergency exit. Don't go from car to car while the train is moving. And so there's signs posted with these warnings all over, these 3 rules. And Thomas said, I saw every one of those. I rode the train like 2 times, and I saw every one of those rules being broken. I said, yeah, me too. It didn't take long to see somebody playing their music without headphones and boombox or whatever. Boombox, kids, that's a radio. And so playing their music loud, and somebody smoking whatever it was, wherever it was, and going from car to car, and all of those things. In fact, once I saw one guy breaking all 3 of those rules at the same time. It was a little scary because he was riding the train kind of between cars and smoking his favorite whatever and playing his music, and I was a little worried about him, and I saw all these folks breaking the rules, and I wondered, why does this happen? And I was looking around as we rode all around Chicago on these trains, and one other thing really stood out to me. Like every time we got on the train and we sat down and I looked around, and I was just struck by how sad everyone looked. I mean, every single person, that's probably a little exaggeration, but so many folks looked sad as they sat there on the train, and I thought, what's going on here? And I think one of the reasons that people look sad, it was sort of a security blanket, right? It's a defense mechanism. Everybody had their earbuds in, listening to a podcast or music, so they wouldn't have to associate with folks around them. They were reading a book or looking at their phone and doing whatever on their phone or device so they wouldn't have to interact with anyone around them. And I thought, these folks breaking these rules, it's really just another sort of security blanket, right? It's to say, hey, stay away from me. Right? Put up this barrier. And look, I am not an extroverted person. Like, it's not my favorite thing to get on, say, the train or a bus or go into a room with folks I don't know and strike up conversations. But I couldn't get over the fact that everybody was sort of had this security blanket, this barrier up. And so I got on the train, and every time I just tried to make eye contact with people. Just something like that. A nod, say hello. I just tried to break down that barrier, that security blanket. And I realized that, we all sort of do that from time to time, and we just want to be covered by something. And I thought, man, what a shame. What a shame. In a nation where isolation is increasing more and more, we have fewer meaningful relationships in our lives now than we used to. I talked to somebody between services and said, well, it used to be you sat on your front porch, and now we open a garage door with a button, and we close a garage door with a button, and we don't interact even in our neighborhoods like that. I said, even when we go to the grocery store now, like, we check ourselves out. We don't even have a conversation with the cashier way we had to all the time back in the day, right? We're just more and more isolated. And more than ever, I suppose, we need fellowship. We need one another. And it's a different kind of security blanket. We've been talking in Hebrews about how we mature, how do we grow in this faith, how do we become more like Jesus, how does that relationship happen? And it happens in community. It happens as a part of his family. And this fellowship, one with another, is this security blanket that provides us with a way to get to know him more and more. And I suppose we have to pay attention to these warnings in Hebrews, but the fellowship of believers is a security blanket that grows our faith, that helps us to grow in him. And I think that Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 to 25, issues 3 warnings about fellowship that we simply cannot ignore. Now, if you have your Bibles, I'd love for you to open them up to the 10th chapter, where we're going to wrap up the 10th chapter today, and next week will be our last sermon in this preaching series, Shaky Feeling. But this morning, we're in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 and 25, three warnings that are issued really in this one directive. There's one command to follow in these two verses, but we're going to talk about it in these three warnings. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24, God's word says this: "And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." Three warnings that are issued here. And warning number one is to make sure to stir one another up to good deeds. Make sure that we're stirring one another up to these good works that are talked about here in verse 24. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. We've talked all around these verses in Hebrews chapter 10. We started a few weeks ago in the beginning of Hebrews chapter 10. We talked about the sufficiency of Christ's sacrifice and how his sacrifice is enough for every single one of us. Tim says it's even enough for St. Louis. It's totally sufficient. It's more than enough. And we talked about how we can draw near to God because of his sacrifice, because of that blood covering us and the forgiveness of sins. And we can have confidence to come into the presence of God and to have this relationship with him and to draw near to him. And then last week we talked about the end of chapter 10, and we talked about the consequences of walking away from that relationship and what that looked like and how serious that was. And here we kind of get the nuts and bolts of how do we maintain, how do we stay in relationship with Jesus? How do we continue to grow that relationship? And it begins here in verse 24 with this idea of making sure to stir one another up to good deeds. Let us consider how to stir up one another. This word consider, we've come across this already in the book of Hebrews, and it was way back in chapter 3, the first verse. And it talked about, okay, you need to consider Jesus. Way back in chapter 3, verse 1, let us consider Jesus. Some translations say, fix your eyes on Jesus. We talked about how it was this idea of centering our attention on him, focusing on him, keeping him as our plumb line, as our direction. And if we want to walk like Jesus walked, if we want to be disciples of him, if we want to look more and more like Jesus, then we need to consider him. We need to fix our eyes on him. We need to pay attention to Jesus. We have to, if we want to do what Jesus would do, we have to know what Jesus would do. And so we have to center our attention on him. I don't think any follower of Jesus would say, well, you're off track there, right? It's pretty obvious. Of course we should consider, of course we should fix our eyes on Jesus. And here in verse 24, though, that same word is used, that same emphasis is given, but the point of our considering, the point of our fixing our eyes is different. And really the one directive of Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24 and 25 is, hey, consider one another. Pay attention to one another. Just as we're to fix our eyes on Jesus, we're to pay attention to those folks around us. We're to love our neighbor. We're to do life with each other. Consider one another. It's really, by the way, this is just when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest command? He gave two answers, right? He said, well, the greatest command is to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. In other words, fix your eyes on him. Keep paying attention to him. Don't get distracted. He said the second greatest is to love your neighbor as yourself. It's taken us 10 chapters to get to where Jesus got in those two commands, right? Fix your eyes on Jesus and consider one another. Pay attention to those around us. And let us consider, well, how do we do this? What are we doing? How to stir up one another to love and good works. This word that's translated as stir up, some different translations, of course, translate this differently. Depending on what you're reading, you might read the word encourage here. You might read the word spur, where to spur one another on to love and good deeds. One translation says to motivate. One translation says to provoke. Provoke is a little closer to it. This idea of stirring up. It's an interesting word that's not used a ton of times in the New Testament. It's only used here in the book of Hebrews and verse 24 of chapter 10, and then in Acts chapter 15, where that word is used to describe a conflict, a problem that Paul and Barnabas have in their relationship. You maybe remember that story. It's a disagreement over John Mark and whether or not to bring him on the missionary journey, and one wants to and another doesn't, and it's such a severe disagreement that it causes Paul and Barnabas to go their separate ways. They split up and they go different directions. And it's this word that usually means to provoke, anger. It's that contention that was present in that relationship. It's the kind of emotion that you feel. I know you guys don't feel this because you're better people than me, but it's that kind of emotion that you feel when somebody cuts you off in traffic. And you're just like, I'm staying right here on this guy's tail to teach him a lesson. It's that kind of that's the word. And certainly it's not used with this idea of provoking anger. In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24, it's used in a positive way, but the intensity of that word is no less here. It's this idea, sometimes if you just read the word encouragement here, and you think about, as we generally think about the word encouragement, we're only going to think about, nice things that people tell us. And too often, truly, when we think about encouragement in the church, we limit it only to sort of, candy coating what's going on. We sort of only want to say nice things. We wouldn't want to, the New Testament says, rebuke one another. Oh man, it's hard for us to get to that place. But I think about, raising kids as a parent. When our kids were little, what kind of parent would you be if you just said, hey, yeah, go ahead and touch that hot stove. It's all right. You want to play in the street? Yeah, go ahead. Have fun. Try to get hit by a Mercedes. What kind of parent would you be? You would want to. And the loving thing to do would be to rebuke that child. Several years ago, we had a mom come through our Explore Wallula class, and she stayed a little bit after, and she said, I've got a son, he's 4, he's heading into kindergarten, and this year he's going to go to kindergarten, and I just have some questions that I need to talk to you about. I said, sure, I'll help any way I can. And she said, well, my son who's 4 thinks he's a girl and he wants to wear a dress to kindergarten. What should I tell him? And I said, tell him no. Tell him no. He's 4 years old. You wouldn't let him play in the street. You wouldn't let him, sit on the stove as you're heating up supper. Tell him no, it's not okay. What kind of parent wouldn't offer this kind of loving rebuke? Well, the same thing's true here. One book I'm reading is called Holy Grit, and the author says it like this: and often what is best is an urgent warning and even rebuke, especially for those tempted to abandon their faith. Too often we are so overly concerned about being nice and affirming that we willingly stand by and watch others shipwreck their faith. Such niceness isn't ultimately loving. It's relational cowardice. We'd rather be regarded as non-judgmental than keep our friends from ruin. Last week we just talked about the consequences of walking away from Jesus. That conversation about what does it look like to continue in sin. There are real, eternal consequences. That if you love someone, demand action. Now, there's a right way and a wrong way to have that conversation. And ultimately, it begins in this fellowship with one another so that we have a relationship, a foundation from which to speak, this this history from which we've earned the right to be heard. But this word to stir up, it can't just be as simple and as easy as just an encouraging word all of the time. Once in a while, every single one of us needs that metaphorical kick in the seat of the pants. Right? We need what the New Testament calls a rebuke. We need to hear the truth in love. And we stir up this intense relationship is to stir up one another to love and good works. It's really important, I think, that these two words are so closely related. Love, this is Greek word agape. It doesn't show up a ton of times in Hebrews. Here it is. And this word agape, this godly love, is demonstrated through these good works. You maybe remember a couple other places in chapter 6 and chapter 9, I think, when these works that lead to death or destruction are mentioned. And here these good works are set up in contrast to that sin in our life. We're to walk away from that old life and live in this new life where we are walking after Jesus and becoming more and more like him. Where we are sharing the love of Jesus with others. One translation, and I don't remember which one it is, but it phrases this verse like this: think of ways to encourage one another to outbursts of love and good deeds. And I suppose there's kind of that positive idea of encouragement, but maybe with the intensity of stir up still, these outbursts of love and good deeds. You know, Tim mentioned it in his communion meditation, but it's so encouraging to see these kinds of outbursts of love in and through Wallula Christian Church. I just made a short list in this last week or so of times when I've seen or I've encountered or I anticipate these outbursts of love and good deeds. Maybe some of you have followed, some of you were there. 14 folks returned from Honduras, and maybe you saw those pictures on social media, or you had a conversation with somebody that was there, and all those pictures show folks, maybe participating in a service project, some kind of construction project, or in the medical clinic and distributing medication and taking blood pressures and the dental clinic when that dental work was done, or simply building relationships with kids and families and renewing some of those relationships and building new relationships. It was easy. There were literally snapshots of outbursts of love and good deeds. And I'm so grateful that, it's not only when we travel around the globe, when we leave the country to share these kinds of outbursts. It's easy to find here at Wallula Christian Church. And maybe you just have to look to places like the Shelter of Hope on Monday night and Tuesday morning and people serving there, or the Joy Meadow service in the next week or so, and distributing school supplies and sharing and just loving on foster kids and foster families. You can see this outburst of love and good deeds. There's a young couple in our church, Duncan and Madison, who just had a baby, and someone here at Wallula set up a food train to provide meals for that family after the birth of their child. And so many of these, by the way, this is one that stands out to me. So many of these are truly outbursts of love and good deeds. It's not like these service projects all come from one central location. It's not like the preacher is organizing look, you guys know already I'm not capable enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not nice enough to organize all of this stuff. I'm so encouraged, and one of the things I love about Wallula Christian Church is that these outbursts of love and good deeds are truly outbursts of love and good deeds. They're just folks following after Jesus. The storm came through and we had tree limbs down, and folks came and helped clean up the tree limbs. Yes, on campus, but in yards of neighbors. I had neighbors say, man, you didn't have to do that, after guys had already cleaned up the limbs, had already taken care of it. I'm thinking about my wife and daughters who I think are heading to Bartlesville, Oklahoma tomorrow to help their Clayton, who's a first-year teacher, decorate his classroom a little bit. And I know there's teachers here that would love that kind of help. I think about the guys who helped Zach move this last week, or Third Thursday ministry, and providing those meals. I think about this family who I just learned this morning has a little guy in the hospital. And so their kids are staying with another family here at Wallula, and there's plans to provide and care for those kids while mom and dad have to be back and forth and be at the hospital. And all of those things, again, are just taking place because people are loving like Jesus loved. There's families with surgeries planned to come up, and I heard this morning about plans to care for them in that way. And truly, our small groups are kind of the front lines to this. Our small groups are so important because, I think about that long list, and I say, we are not perfect. And there are situations and there are times in families' life where they're struggling and we miss it, where we miss the opportunity to help. And sometimes that's because we're flawed and broken and we mess up, and sometimes it's because we flat don't know. And our small groups are kind of the front lines. If you want to help us to make sure that we can love like Jesus and our church family well, then broaden that network of communication. Right? Many times it'll be the small group that cares for that family in need, that provides that help that's necessary. And for sure, we have a care ministry that can help when maybe somebody's not involved in a small group, or maybe when that small group is truly small and they need a little extra help, and all of those things. And we want to come together as a larger family when necessary and help where we can. And sometimes it just comes down to figuring it out, to hearing about the situation. And small groups provide us with that frontline care that is so necessary. We want to make sure to stir one another up, to provoke one another to good deeds. Warning number 2 is to make sure to keep meeting together. Verse 25 says, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Verse 25 could literally start by saying, by not neglecting to meet one another. In other words, how are we going to stir one another up to love and good deeds? By not giving up meeting together. Evidently, there were some folks that this author was preaching to and writing to that had already quit, that had already started to walk away from the family of God. They'd walked away from that fellowship. And it was just a choice that should have been so clear as to be detrimental. That this Jewish Christian audience, part of their heritage was this gathering together. You go back to the life of Jesus, and you can see him living out this example. He lived it out well, and then the early church just followed suit. They just kept going. If you just walk your way through the Gospel of Luke, you go back to Luke chapter 2, verse 49, and you're in the middle of this story where 12-year-old Jesus was in the temple. You remember the story. Mary and Joseph head out, and Mary thinks Jesus is with Joseph, and Joseph thinks Jesus is with Mary, and they get halfway home, and they realize, we don't have our oldest child. He's not just our oldest child, he's God's child. We should probably go back and get him. And so they go back to the temple, and I love this idea because here's Mary and Joseph confronting Jesus. Say, what in the world were you thinking, Jesus? When you saw the caravan leave, why didn't you join in? And Jesus' response, why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? From 12 years old, Jesus made it a priority to worship with others. Mary and Joseph go back and they find him teaching the rabbis. You flip over to chapter 4, verse 16 in Luke, and you read about Jesus returning to Nazareth, and this is what it says. And he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. and he stood up to read. It was Jesus' habit, his custom, to go to the synagogue. He went to church weekly. That's what that verse says. You flip over chapter 9, verse 11, and you see, man, Jesus didn't just meet in the synagogue, but he met with people anywhere he could. You read the story of him feeding the 5,000. You go to chapter 10, verse 38, and he shows up at Mary and Martha's house. And so he meets with large crowds. He feeds 5,000 people. He has dinner with 5,000. He has dinner with a handful of folks at Mary and Martha's house. Chapter 22, verse 14 is the institution of the Lord's Supper, and so he's celebrating Passover with his closest group of friends. Over and over, Jesus met with other believers, and he gave us this example, and then the early church just followed suit. They knew how important this was. Right after Pentecost, Peter preaches this sermon, and thousands of people give their life to Jesus, and right after that, in verses 42 to 47 of Acts chapter 2, we read, "And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers, and awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles, and all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need, and day by day attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people, and the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved." I suppose preachers love Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, because we like to say, look, church attendance is so important. Now, there are tons of folks who say that's not really what verse 25 in Hebrews chapter 10 is talking about. It's not talking about showing up to a worship service once a week. And I would agree. I don't think it's only talking about showing up to a worship service once a week, but I for sure don't think it's talking about less. I think it's reaching back to Acts chapter 2 when they gathered together, not just in the temple, but they broke bread in their homes together, where they shared everything in common, where this idea of fellowship and community goes way past 1 hour a week. It's living life together. This idea of breaking bread, one of the reasons we encourage small groups to have cookies is not just because we love cookies, right? Whatever it is, vegetable tray, go for it. Whatever it is. Have supper together, break bread together, because there's real intimacy when you sit down and eat with someone else. Just make a list of folks you ate with this week. It's probably people pretty important to you. It's folks that you're trying to grow a relationship with, that you want to know better. Now, we need to do life together. For sure, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25 isn't only talking about worship on Sunday mornings, but it's not talking about less than that. It's encouraging us to grow real relationships with each other, to really love one another. Sunday mornings matter for sure. They are a great starting place. I heard a preacher this week. He's just getting killed on the internet, just getting killed on social media. This guy is taking a beating. He's got a large church and he has a large reach on the web. I had somebody tell me this week that, hey, so you're an internet sensation. And I just kind of looked at them like, what are you talking about? They'd been listening to the podcast, and so they were joking around. And it's kind of cool, actually, to look at the listeners and viewers on Sunday morning, that sometimes we reach folks, in a different country. We've had folks from Australia watch and on a Sunday morning. We have folks from all around the United States who listen to the podcast once in a while. But one of the things I'm really grateful for is that we're not truly an internet sensation, because I say dumb things. And when I say dumb things, I don't take as much abuse as some other guys who say things that a little sarcastically, that it shouldn't have been phrased exactly like this. But this preacher is just taking a beating on social media because he said, look, people say that church is just a production on Sunday mornings. There's lights and all that stuff, and it's just a production. But when you come late and leave early, you're just feeding into that persona. You're living out what other people criticize Sunday morning worship as being. He said, and then he went on, this is the really snarky part. He went on to say, and don't get me started on folks just staying at home in their pajamas worshiping online. And it was snarky. And it was maybe said in kind of a gruff way. But folks, there's real truth there. Oh, don't misunderstand. Like, if you're going to be 15 minutes late, would I rather you be 15 minutes late than not come? Yeah, for sure. I heard a preacher, a guy who preached a long time ago who's dead now, said half a meal is better than no meal. Right? For sure. And I understand that life happens sometimes. Like, I can't imagine, when our kids were little, we had 3 kids under 4 or whatever. I don't remember. I don't know how old they are now, but they were, and they were little kids. I can't imagine getting them all together and going to church because I was gone. It was easy for me. I just left before any of them woke up. And I was out. And wrangling those kids, I promise you I couldn't do it. Our youngest daughter, Zoe, just came home yesterday, so this is just for her. I remember one time when Zoe, she was a little girl, I brought her to preschool, and I delivered her to preschool without any underpants. I could not get all 3 of them to church on time. Wouldn't have happened. So I get that it's difficult, right? I get that it's hard, and sometimes just running late, I'm not criticizing. I don't think this guy was really criticizing, but if you show up, if that's your habit all the time, if you never talk to somebody that you're sitting near, like if you just ignore the opportunity this morning to go meet a small group leader and even consider joining a small group, you've just lost this opportunity to really be a part of the body of Christ. Can you come late and leave early every Sunday? Absolutely, and we're grateful you're here. But just know that you're missing the opportunity to be blessed and, oh, by the way, to bless someone else. Because it's not a one-way street. It's a relationship. And just as much as I believe that you need the church needs you. Make sure that you keep meeting together. Don't give up. The Bible calls this koinonia, fellowship. It's one of our main goals of small groups is just to build these kind of meaningful relationships. Our main goal in small groups is to, yes, help grow this relationship with God, this vertical relationship, that we want to provide opportunities to build meaningful friendships. I can't promise you that you're going to meet your next best friend, right? But I don't think it's necessary. I think you will grow meaningful relationships that you can live in biblical community with, so that when hard times come, there's somebody that you can talk to. When good times come, there's somebody you can celebrate with. I love this story. We had a gentleman start attending Wallula some time ago, and he came up to me one time, and we were talking. He said, the best thing about Wallula Christian Church? And I was ready for it, because I knew he was going to say the preaching, and so I was ready for it. And I said, yeah, what's going on? And he said, well, the best thing about Wallula Christian Church is this men's small group that I'm a part of. I said, really? Well, tell me about it. What's going on? And he had several things to say about this small group, but then he started talking about Calvin Grafe in particular. And he just said, Calvin has made such a difference in my life, and he was telling me about this. And I walked away, and I was thinking, how did that happen? Because these guys are kind of in different stages of life, right? They don't have, that I know of, they don't share any common work background. They don't share any common educational background. They don't have any hobbies in common. There's no reason. There's no reason for these guys to be friends outside of their common relationship in Jesus. Now, that's kind of meaningful relationship that can be developed in small groups when you don't stop meeting together. When you take that extra step kind of outside of Sunday morning, when you take that step and give it a chance to grow a relationship, make sure you keep meeting together. Warning number 3 is to make sure you're acting with purpose. I'm just reminded of this at the end of verse 25. It talks about the habit of some. This is a negative habit. They've been walking away from those relationships. They've been walking away from the family of God. They've been walking away from the church. And we want to flip that, don't we? We want to develop a habit of walking towards Jesus. We want to develop a habit of walking towards his family, of walking into relationships. And so I just looked up this how to develop a habit. And one article gave me 5 things to do. And I just thought, man, this describes what a small group looks like. It says set a specific goal. So your goal for small group, hey, I want to attend 10 of these small group meetings this fall. Right? Set a specific goal. Create a detailed cue-based plan. In other words, I'm going to show up at this guy's house on Wednesday at this time to be a part of this small group. Number 3 is to make it fun. We talk to our small group leaders that this is one of the values in our small groups. Yes, we want to answer some questions about the Sunday sermon. Yes, we want to dive into God's Word. Yes, we want to get through the study. But we want you to have fun. We want you to stop and have a barbecue. We want you to take the night and go bowling. We want you to experience life with one another. Just have conversations in those groups that have fun together. We want you to play, study, and pray together in our small groups. That's a value. Just make it fun. Have a good time. Number 4 is to foster flexibility. So in other words, don't beat yourself up about missing once in a while. Number 5 is to find the right kind of social support. This is your opportunity to do just that at this Taste of Small Groups. You can sign up for a group that probably has a core group of folks that are meeting. And that might seem daunting, but I believe it's a really, really good thing. Because I know that if you said, hey, you know what I really need to do? I need to start jogging. Well, there's a way that you can be successful at that and a way that's going to be more of a struggle. If you join an established running club where people are already showing up at a certain time and a certain place to run around, right? Why would people do that? Anyway, they're doing that. That's way more successful than if you say, I'm going to get together a few of my buddies who have never jogged before and we're going to try to start together. There's different levels of accountability, right? There's some accountability, but it's, if they're not committed to it, it's going to be easy for them to call and say, I'm not showing up, and you say, I'm not showing up. The established kind of social network there is more meaningful. You have an opportunity to be a part of those groups right now, so that we can encourage one another. We're back to that stirring up, so that we can be the gathered church that then scatters. Right? We want to gather together to encourage one another so that we can go to the real front lines in our workplaces, in our families, in our clubs, in our teams, in our schools, where we can be sharing the love of Jesus on the actual front lines with people. All the more as you see the day drawing near. This is where I think, okay, we have to be sure that we're acting on purpose because we have a deadline. There's a buzzer that's going to sound. The 9th inning is going to be played out. Now, we don't know exactly when that is. Jesus is promising to return. We don't know when that is, but that day, when you read the day in the New Testament, it's probably talking about the day of judgment. Jesus is returning. We don't know when that deadline is. And what's more, none of us know when our personal deadline is. We have the opportunity to be the hands and feet of Jesus until we don't. I was just yesterday at a memorial service for a preacher at Legacy Christian Church who died a month or so ago, and just had a huge impact on the body of Christ in the United States and around the world. Thousands and thousands of people at this memorial service. It was easy to see the impact that this guy who died way too young had. And he, just like every single one of us, had the opportunity to share the love of Christ. And he did it with all of his heart. until he didn't. And live on purpose. Build relationships on purpose. Part of that, folks, it's just showing up. You know, I talked about riding that public transportation in Chicago and looking at sad faces. And I'm not an extrovert, but I just tried to make eye contact and to interact, maybe just a head nod, a little wave, say hello if somebody would engage a little bit on the train. And I tried all week long, and it took until the very last day before somebody had a conversation with me. But I just kept trying. And then I had this great conversation, and he asked me where I was from and how many kids I had, and we talked about it. He asked me where I was staying, and then I thought, I'm glad we're leaving because I'm not sure I should be telling this guy where I'm staying. I mean, I don't know anything about him, right? But I'm having this conversation, and I'm just so excited that somebody would talk to me, and all I did all week was show up. You know, and that's with different random people on the train. Think of the value. Think of the value of showing up in one place with the same people week after week and the relationships that can be grown and the difference that can be made, all because we just show up. I'm grateful that Jesus showed up. Let's go and do the same. Let's stand and worship him.